Hi everybody, Dr. Ahles here. In this short video, we're going to talk about the structures of the pancreas and each of the hormones that they secrete. When we talk about the pancreas, we are discussing an organ that's found just below the liver. It connects directly to the small intestine, to the very first part of the small intestine called the duodenum. What makes the pancreas special in our discussion of the endocrine system is not only does it secrete hormones, which is what makes it endocrine, but it also secretes digestive enzymes, which is what makes it an exocrine organ as well. So when we're thinking about the exocrine part of the pancreas, we have a group of cells that are called the pancreatic acinar cells. These cells make juice, essentially, that's going to be spit out from the pancreas into the intestine as it's mixed here with the bile that's coming from the liver or the gallbladder. Because we're secreting things into the digestive tract and not into the bloodstream, that makes this an exocrine function. Now, in typical fashion, the endocrine functions of the pancreas are things that we're going to spit out into the bloodstream. In particular, when we talk about the hormones that the pancreas is responsible for, all of them play some role directly or indirectly in regulating blood glucose. So let's look at those cells that are part of the endocrine portion of the pancreas. In the pancreas, when we zoom up close, we see what are called islets of Langerhans. So as we're discussing the fancy cell types here that we're going to get into with the different hormones that they secrete, we're focusing on the parts called the islets of Langerhans. Now, notice, so that's this mass of cells here. Notice that all around it, we also see these little yellow groups of cells. These are those cells that I mentioned before, the acinar cells, that are secreting things that are going into the digestive tract. So not all of the pancreas is about hormones. We have a lot of these little groups of acinar cells that make the digestive enzymes that they spit out into this middle open space and ultimately ends up in the digestive tract. But let's shift our focus back to the endocrine portion of the pancreas and talk about each of the kind of cells that we find there. So the first type that we see in the islet of Langerhans are what we call alpha cells. And when we talk about alpha cells, they secrete a hormone called glucagon. A good note maybe for you to put next to this, and we'll talk about this more, is glucagon is the hormone we release when blood glucose is gone or the level of it is really low. So my alpha cells will spit out glucagon if there's not a lot of glucose in the bloodstream. Now the opposite of that are the pancreatic beta cells. And perhaps you've heard about these in the context of diabetes. We're going to talk more about that in another video. But the pancreatic beta cells are the cells that make that hormone we've all heard of the pancreas, called insulin. Your body spits out insulin when there's a lot of blood there's a lot of glucose in the bloodstream. And when it detects all that glucose in the bloodstream, it tells the cells to take glucose in. So insulin tells cells to take in glucose. Glucagon tells cells the glucose is gone. We don't have enough in the bloodstream. These two are going to work together primarily to balance your blood sugar levels. But at the same time, we're also spitting out another enzyme called somatostatin. Somatostatin is created by pancreatic delta cells. And as we'll see in a moment, this hormone actually regulates the activities of glucagon and insulin. My final type of cells are called F cells, and when we talk about F cells, these are the cells that secrete pancreatic polypeptide. This is my final level of control in the islet of Langerhans. Pancreatic polypeptide is going to control the activity of somatostatin, which controls the activity of insulin and glucagon. So all four of these cell types each secrete a different kind of hormone, and each of these hormones play a role in blood sugar balance. When we talk about these different hormones that are secreted by the pancreas, I want you to kind of think about them like a tug of war match. So these different hormones are going to have opposite functions of each other, and it's a good idea as we're studying them to compare and contrast them. So we're going to start over here with the first compare and contrast, and this is insulin and glucagon, the two most commonly known hormones from the pancreas. When we talk about insulin, this is the hormone that's made by those pancreatic beta cells. Recall that glucagon was made by the alpha cells, so we come from different types of cells. Insulin is released when blood glucose is high, while glucagon is released when blood glucose is low. The effect that these two hormones have, because they're spit out at different times, we know they're going to have opposite effects as well. So remember, like I told you, insulin tells cells to take glucose in. It increases the uptake of glucose. Glucagon, on the other hand, doesn't increase glucose uptake. It increases something called gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis is the process of building new glucose. Several of the cells in your body have the ability to use other types of nutrients to build glucose. When they get the glucagon message, they essentially hear, you're on your own, start making your own glucose. Whereas insulin, there's lots in the blood, take it inside. When we have a lot of sugar in the blood, we will often want to store some of that sugar for later use. So insulin tells our cells to also build glycogen or synthesize glycogen. This is a long, stringy form of glucose that holds a lot of sugar for us for later use. Compare that to glucagon. When I don't have a lot of glucose in the bloodstream, I'm actually going to break down that stored sugar, that glycogen, to allow me to raise the level of glucose in the bloodstream. The one other function of these two to compare and contrast is in a situation where we have a lot of sugar in the bloodstream, we're also going to pull in amino acids and fatty acids. We can use those later as nutrient sources, or we can use them to build proteins, to build fats. When we secrete glucagon, instead of building things, we're going to keep breaking things down, including triglycerides, which are another energy source in our bloodstream. So here's our tug of war between insulin and glucagon. Make sure we know who makes these hormones, when we would release them, and all of their different effects on the body. Let's transition though to the other two sets of hormones that the pancreas spits out. This is somatostatin and pancreatic polypeptide. Our first compare and contrast for these two hormones is the kinds of cells that make them. Delta cells make somatostatin. F cells make pancreatic polypeptide. Like I mentioned before, the job of somatostatin is to decrease the level of insulin or glucagon that's being released. So as we get closer back to homeostasis, somatostatin will talk to our alpha cells or our beta cells and tell them to stop spitting out their hormone. We're back to balance again. Somatostatin also decreases the level of growth hormone that's being released. If you recall from our discussion of the HPS axis, growth hormone really changes the way that cells are metabolizing things. So as we get closer to normal, somatostatin tells the body, hey, don't mess with your metabolism by working with growth hormone. And also, don't increase or decrease blood glucose. We're stable. So somatostatin is how we manage homeostasis. Might be a good way to remember it. Pancreatic polypeptide, though, made by those F cells, this is kind of the ruler over all. So pancreatic polypeptide also decreases hormone release, but it's actually decreasing the release of somatostatin. So these two are going to be opposite to each other. And the other effect of pancreatic polypeptide is to increase the digestive enzyme secretion. Remember that those enzymes were made by the pancreatic acinar cells. So keep in mind that we've got pancreatic polypeptide and somatostatin. They're playing tug of war back and forth, as we have insulin and glucagon playing tug of war back and forth. A brief jaunt with you into how insulin and glucagon actually work. When our cells receive the message, insulin, Insulin, remember, attaches to that special kind of hormone receptor called tyrosine kinase receptors. These were the ones that when they got their message, they autophosphorylated, they got their own phosphate groups, and they used those phosphate groups to activate an intracellular receptor. Ultimately, what insulin makes the cell do is build a kind of protein called GLUT4. This is a transport protein that brings glucose into the cell. So when we're considering how insulin works, it creates a pump that's going to work to bring glucose into the cell. Compare that to glucagon. When we talk about what happens with glucagon, notice that glucagon, we have a receptor that utilizes a secondary messenger and that adenylyl cyclase protein that helped us to generate cyclic AMP. Once we have cyclic AMP, we can go through and create an enzyme that breaks down glycogen. So rather than bringing sugar into the cell, what glucagon says is, I've stored all of this glycogen. If I chop it up, it turns into glucose. And once I've chopped it up, I can then shift it out of the cell using a different GLUT protein, GLUT2. So keep in mind with insulin and glucagon, not only are they made in different places, they also have very different effects that starts down at the molecular level, that starts down at what happens inside the cells. One more comparison for us with insulin and glucagon. Taking what we talked about before, we're going to secrete insulin when we have hyperglycemia. Underline, highlight, star, hyperglycemia. Remember that hyper means too much. So when we have too much sugar in the bloodstream, the pancreatic beta cells spit out insulin. Insulin tells the cells of the body, take in sugar. It tells the liver, turn that sugar into glycogen. And as these things happen, the level of glucose in the bloodstream will slowly start to go down. Ultimately, if we get to a place where we're below normal hypoglycemia, we see a negative feedback loop. Remember that a negative feedback loop says, whatever we're doing, we need to stop it right now. So when blood sugar gets too low, that sends a message up to those beta cells, hey, stop telling everyone to take in insulin or take in glucose. We don't have enough in the bloodstream. Now, the other scenario of when we would use insulin secretion is when the parasympathetic nervous system is activated. Remember that the parasympathetic nervous system is part of the autonomic nervous system. This is the rest and digest division. If we've just eaten a big meal, if we are slowing down, that will also stimulate the beta cells to secrete insulin. Now, compare that to glucagon. We're going to release glucagon when we activate the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic being fight or flight. When I secrete glucagon, that causes me to break down my glycogen in those liver cells, and it causes me to start building new sugar in the liver. As I build these, and like we saw in the previous picture, spit that glucose out, my blood glucose level is going to get closer and closer to normal. If it gets too high though, if I hit hyperglycemia, notice that again, I've got negative feedback that goes up to those alpha cells and says, hey, stop spitting out this message. We don't need any more. So big picture, when we talk about the pancreas, know that it spits stuff out of the body, that's its exocrine function, and stuff into the body, these 4 hormones. Make sure we know which kind of cell makes each hormone. Make sure we know what those hormones do, and make sure you're familiar, especially with insulin and glucagon, of how the negative feedback loop process works to regulate their secretion.